There is a question about whether, when COVID has settled down and Vladimir Putin is watching the Russian equivalent of Clueless in a retirement home somewhere, that the world will go back to normal after all of that. And that means more international trade, more just-in-time supply chains, and less protectionism and localism that some, like Steve Keen, are calling for. So today, I relay some of the arguments made by the FT columnist Martin Wolf last week in an article called The Big Mistakes of the Anti-Globalisers. He says this emerging group are overstating the merits of self-sufficiency. So let's get Steve's take on that today on the Debunking Economics podcast. And my name is Phil Dobby, of course, but you probably know that after 5 years and 280 episodes or so. Look, we've talked a bit this year about whether the supply chain problems post-COVID and the impact of the war in Ukraine and what that's having on fuel and energy supplies, whether the learning will be less globalization, shorter supply chains, more self-sufficiency, more food and energy security. It sounds logical, doesn't it? Although it also sounds very expensive. And does that mean less productive? So what prompted me going down this road again was I was reading an article in the FT last week, an opinion piece by Martin Wolf, who I'm sure you don't agree with on lots of things, but I'm sure you also agree that he is quite a good thinker. And he points to, his argument is, no, we are going to, jump back to where we were just because we have seen so many benefits from global trade. It would be hard to move away from all of that.
Yeah, I do like Martin, and he's a pretty open-minded person who, he generally sticks inside the mainstream envelope, but he's open-minded to other views. But on this one, I disagree with him. I think, and it's very hard for people to imagine there's a break where things are never the same as they were before. And I think this is partly what's going on here, that, those advantages were so great, we have to go back to them, but they depend upon conditions that no longer apply.
Because his point is, between 1980 and 2018, when we saw global merchandise trade increase significantly as a percentage of GDP, virtually all countries are better off as a result of that. Global inequality declined, he says. The share of the world's population in extreme poverty fell from 42% in 1981 to just 8.6% in 2018. So he reckons those numbers speak for themselves. I mean, that is, when you look at it like that, that period has been an amazing success story, and we can put that down to global trade, can't we?
It's a globalized thing. I actually first wrote about this, I think, in 1980, maybe 1979, looking at the growth of globalized production. And I actually built a little mathematical model of it for a conference I ran called Trade to Whose Advantage, which had the best cartoon cover for a conference ever, which was done by Patrick Cook. And I'll talk about that in a tick. He was a famous Australian satirical cartoonist. But what I looked at was, in the mathematical model I did, that probably nobody has read, is that if you look at what actually profits out of it, it's going to be capitalists in the first world, capitalists in the third world, and workers in the third world. But workers in the first world will not do so well. And that is really the subtext of all of this. So what Martin is looking at and giving that comment about the decline in inequality, that's a decline in inequality between countries. So the level of difference between the salary of a Chinese worker and the salary of an American worker has fallen quite substantially. But if you look within countries, what you find is actually, certainly in the first world, an amplification of inequality. So the profits of of capitalists, particularly in America, have risen far faster than the wages of workers in America, and the nature of work has also changed in America. So this is a large part of why people are so dissatisfied and why they voted for Trump in 2016.
So, on there, he points to Elhanan Heltman, who wrote a book, Globalization and Inequality. He's a professor of international trade at Harvard. And, he addresses this idea that, we're seeing inequality in richer countries as a result of all of this. But, because of that point you just made, that we might do all the smart stuff in the rich countries, but all the poor jobs get shipped off overseas. The argument there is, well, that might be partially because of globalization, but it's largely because of the technological developments that are favouring highly skilled workers. So automation, for example, even if we didn't have international trade and we just brought everything on shore, those lower paid jobs obviously would get done by machines if we could. So we'd still have that inequality in richer countries because it's the skilled jobs are the ones that are paying.
Yeah, there's a typical micro thinking by a mainstream economist. Yes, that there is that development over time, that low wage, the less skill you have, the less bargaining power you've got, definitely. But when you take a look at the macro dynamics, what you have is you have a decline in demand, a decline in aggregate demand in the first world, because you have workers being sacked. They go from being employed to unemployed, or employed in high wage positions to low wage. And there's also an issue there, of course, about just how many skilled workers there are left in America now, given that transition to globalised production. But there is a decline which would have happened to some extent anyway, but it would have happened inside the confines of one market, and you would have had all the aggregate demand effects would have been contained inside that one market. Instead, what you've had is a shifting of aggregate demand off to the third world at the expense of the first. Now, that's not a bad thing. Okay, I'm saying that if you look at what China's actually done out of that, it's been an incredible increase in the welfare levels of something of the order of certainly 500 million to 1 billion people. The population of China is 1.4 billion, but the increase in the standard of living in China is gobsmacking when you've had the chance, as I did, to compare it pre the globalisation to post-globalisation. So if you look at the global level, then yes, it has been a reason for a dramatic skill transfer and a rise in living standards in parts of the third world. But for the workers back in the first world, they got screwed. They lost, not only did they lose their high school jobs, they went from high school to low school jobs, they also lost their bargaining power. And that's what is really leading to the level of discontent you can find in Western nations, because
they lost their bargaining power, because it's not you against the person next door, it's you against the person on the other side of the world who's going to do it cheaper.
Yeah. And that's where the racism I've seen has come from as well.
Right, but that argument that if we did try and bring those jobs back on shore, as Donald Trump was trying to do, are we going to find that the answer to them being too expensive is that we will just automate it? So does it really make any difference whether it's onshore or offshore? If it's onshore, we'll probably replace you with a machine anyway.
Well, in fact, a fair bit of the creativity of capitalism comes out of the desire of capitalists to replace workers with machinery, to reduce the cost. I mean, that's the classic instance of the spinning jenny, way back in the very early days of the Industrial Revolution. And again, this is something, when you look at the data, that the rate of growth of the global economy pre-globalisation was higher than post-globalisation, substantially so. Not the only issue, of course. There's been all the changes in the level of wealth going to the financial sector as well, which is the focus of my work on Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. But fundamentally, this is one of the reasons why you don't have to innovate so quickly, because you can use much lower wage workers and still make that profit margin.
Right, but if you bought it on shore, then you'd be replacing workers anyway by machines, so they wouldn't be any better off. Okay, you might see that innovation. So the rich country would be better off. The poor country hasn't got people employed now in those other jobs. So that job of globally trying to bridge that income divide doesn't exist anymore. So
yeah, I mean, the classic that I ever got about that, I think I've told you several times, was when I was in China on a trip taking a group of Australian journalists for a seminar with Chinese journalists. At the end, we ended up in the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone when the concrete was being laid by CSR, as it happens. Literally, they were at the Free Trade Zone. It was just a development site, and it was literally putting the concrete down for the roads and the building structures and so on. And we had I must say, a wonderful reception by the chief engineer from CSR and his amazingly sociable Northern Beaches wife, and had a wonderful Aussie barbecue in the bottom of China. But we had it explained to us by the managers of the free trade zone that what they were doing was giving this offering, very low wage costs and very low environmental standards and capital costs and so on as well to any American firm that would move its production from America to China. But they also required that company to have a Chinese partner who, regardless of financial circumstances, within 5 years had to own half the company. Now, if you sit down Americans aren't known for their spontaneous generosity, not American corporations anyway. So what on earth are they getting if they're willing to give up half the profits? And that's the scale of the drop in wage costs they were facing. It was more profitable for them to give over half the profits from the operations in China than to have those operations onshore in America. And that's the scale of the transfer they were looking at.
Right, and we are paying the price for that now, of course, because we've become so dependent on China. So if we hadn't been, or if we weren't still, does that mean we would have faced a very different path through COVID-19? There's a question. In fact, lots more questions in the full version of this podcast. If you want to hear it, just how much more efficient or less efficient would we be if we went down the globalization or the localization road? The full half-hour podcast is available to subscribers at debunkingeconomics.com or to anybody who supports Steve Keen, pays more than $10 per month at patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. We're back again next week looking at central banks' approach to fighting inflation. Is the monetary approach the best way? Steve actually reckons that central banks might mean that we end up with higher interest rates and higher inflation. Find out why he thinks that next week on the Debunking Economics podcast. I'm Phil Dobby. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.